Welcome to the Psychopathology Summit 2018. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Dr. Eva Detko, and my guest for this session is Dr. Titus Chiu. Dr. Chiu is a best-selling author, award-winning international speaker, and functional neurologist who is on the mission to transform the face of healthcare for the 1.1 billion people around the world struggling with brain and mental disorders. You may remember, actually, Dr. Chiu from Dr. Mark Hyman's groundbreaking documentary, Broken Brain. Dr. Chiu is the co-founder and clinical director of Cova Family Wellness, a functional medicine center located in Berkeley, California, that specializes in helping people with post-concussion syndrome and other neurological conditions. Dr. Chiu is the #1 best-selling author of Brain Safe and the 6-week plan to heal your brain from concussions, brain injuries, and trauma, just released on Amazon, and we'll be hearing more about it. So Dr. Chiu, welcome to the Psychopathology Summit. It's so great to have you with us, and thank you so much for contributing. It's much appreciated.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure, it really is. I know you've obviously been featured on so many great events and summits, and you've got such a wonderful expertise in the area of functional neurology. But I actually wanted to ask you, first and foremost, what attracted you to this field? Because obviously there's so many different fields to choose from. So something must have happened in your life to attract you to functional neurology, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really started over almost 2 decades ago. And I was living overseas, and I was on my way to work one day on my scooter, and I got hit by a car. And the impact was so strong, it threw me about 10 feet through the air. I landed on my shoulder, dislocated my shoulder, broke my ribs, and was really bloodied up. I actually suffered a minor concussion that day. And so I tried a lot of different things in conventional medicine, but nothing worked. And so the only thing that actually did help me was chiropractic and natural medicine. My brother at the time, he was a chiropractor, and after just a few sessions, I remember just 3 sessions, that chronic pain that I was struggling with, really, I'd almost given up hope that I'd ever recover. Like just a few sessions with him, it was like night and day. And so I was just blown away by that, and I wanted to learn how to do that so I can help other people struggling with chronic pain and concussions just like I had. And so I went to school, and while I was in school, I discovered neurology, and I just really fell in love with the framework. It was a great way of understanding why, we feel the way that we do. Why do we experience the symptoms that we do? Why do our patients? And so I really dove deep into neurology, and it gave me a wonderful way of understanding that big question is why? Why do I have these symptoms? And so that's how I discovered functional neurology, and a lot of the things that I learned along the way in seminars and teaching other doctors really helped me heal from my own broken brain, from my own head injuries. So a firm believer in it, and I feel really blessed to be able to share that with everyone.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I personally, I love chiropractic. I think, and I spoke to Dr. Natasha, your wife, previously, and I do believe that it's an integral part of your sort of overall healthcare plan. It is for me. Nutrition is important. All of those things are important. Emotional, obviously, aspects, meditation, all of those things that we do to address our emotional health. But I actually do I believe in chiropractic being part of that, the piece of the puzzle that sort of makes it all come together. And it can have such profound effect very, very quickly, as you said. I've experienced that myself as well. So what I wanted to ask is, not many people may actually think that there is a link between head injuries and autoimmunity, but I know that obviously you're going to say that there is, and you're going to explain to us what that link is. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people don't realize, even a lot of doctors don't understand the link between head injuries and autoimmunity. And I didn't for a long time either, but one of the things I specialize in my practice now is post-concussion syndrome. But prior to that, saw a lot of patients with autoimmunity, with Hashimoto's, with multiple sclerosis. And I would do a lot of the typical protocols that I learned in seminars and, from studying from the other greats in functional medicine. But after a while, I would find that for some people with autoimmunity, protocol wouldn't work, even if we changed their diet, even if we healed their gut and we did a lot of, emotional work with them, they still would be suffering. And I found for that, small yet significant number of patients with autoimmunity, the common denominator was that they had a history of head injury. And so I wasn't going to ignore that. And so I explored that in greater depth. And I found that through my research, that there's a strong link when someone suffers a head injury that can actually trigger leaky gut within a matter of hours. And so, as you guys probably know, the audience and you, Eva, there's a huge link between leaky gut or gut dysbiosis and gut imbalances and autoimmunity. In fact, with Dr. Fasano's work, he talks about in autoimmunity, the three major factors are number one, genetic predisposition, number two, a trigger, and finally, number three, hyperintestinal permeability or leaky gut. And so there's a very strong connection between patients who have autoimmunity that aren't responding to the typical treatment plans. And a lot of times it's because they've had a history of head injury. And then from that head injury, it triggers leaky gut, and then the immune system becomes dysregulated.
Yeah, because what's interesting is that it's just what you're describing essentially is another form of trauma. And it's a mechanical trauma. But whether we're talking about trauma from the point of view of, emotional trauma or toxic trauma or mechanical trauma, in the end, the body is traumatized and it will respond to the cascade of hormones, etc. It's pretty much, the body won't necessarily distinguish between what type of trauma it is. It will just react. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing with head injuries, all three types of trauma occurs. So you have the physical trauma of the actual head injury, but after the physical trauma, what happens, chemical trauma is released by the immune system within your nervous system, and that causes inflammation. But from there, I can't tell you, every single one of the patients I work with head injuries, they then suffer emotional traumas because a lot of times people don't really understand, either other doctors or even their friends and loved ones, they don't understand what they're going through because they might look completely normal, just like a lot of patients or people with autoimmunity might look completely normal, but underneath there's just this struggle. And so all three, actually, physical, chemical, mental, and emotional traumas happen in every single patient I work with head injuries.
Yeah, actually, it's a good point. It's almost like a cocktail of trauma, really, in there as you're describing. So that's it is an interesting link, and this may well be, as you said, that missing piece of the puzzle for somebody who has addressed the diet and has done various other things along the way, but there is still something missing, and they're not getting the level of recovery that they want. And as you said, that may not be a huge number of people, but it's still significant, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Eva. And the thing is, I've been doing this for so long, and even though it seems like a lot of patients with autoimmunity, they might, when they're just thinking about it, people listening right now, they might be thinking, I've never had a head injury or I've never been knocked out. But the research shows, and I see this in my practice all the time, you don't need to be knocked out or lose consciousness to have a concussion. You could be and get bumped in a car and have some minor whiplash, and that's enough to trigger the chemical trauma in the brain. You could be on a roller coaster and get thrown about and not hit your head whatsoever or lose consciousness. That can also trigger a concussion. And so I actually find that, again, when I started going deeper into my patients' histories and exploring the why weren't they healing from their autoimmune symptoms or their neurological symptoms, I would find that many of them had a history of one or several concussions. And again, not even concussions in the sense that a person gets knocked out or blacked out, or they end up in the ER. Because when I was in that original car accident many years ago, I didn't lose consciousness. I actually was wearing a helmet, and when I hit the ground, the helmet came off, but I didn't lose consciousness, nor did my head hurt, or I didn't have a headache. I mainly suffered from chronic neck and shoulder pain. But it wasn't until years later, and I talk about this in my new book, it wasn't until years later that I started to develop more psychological symptoms like irritability and anger issues, and just a lot of even deeper, darker symptoms like paranoia. And I was never like that growing up. I came from a really great family, very supportive. I never struggled with anger issues or paranoia or any of that stuff. And just within the past maybe decade or so, those symptoms started to creep up, and I was like, what's going on here? And I did an in-depth, analysis into my own history, just like I do for my patients. And sure enough, I'm like, wow, a lot of those symptoms started to creep up after that initial car accident. And so that's the thing. A lot of people think they might not have had a head injury or a concussion because they think, oh, I've never lost consciousness, or I never had bleeding, or I'd never sent to the ER. But a lot of times it could be like these minor head injuries, or even just kind of strong shaking over time that can trigger an inflammatory response. And I find that not even patients with autoimmunity, but obviously patients with neurological symptoms like chronic brain fog, or even people who are starting to lose, cognitive function like early dementia, almost every single one of my patients who I work with brain fog or memory issues, they've had a history of head injury. Again, maybe not something massive, but something that was contributing to a lot of their symptoms. And it wasn't until we started addressing that and treating the actual head injury, in addition to like the diet and supplements, that they started to heal and get better.
And that is actually an excellent point, because of course, what about, team sports at school? We all got knocked about. It wasn't maybe serious, but it could have been repetitive for starters. And, as you said, it doesn't have to be something that you suddenly sort of get on the floor and lose consciousness. So that's a very, very good point. And there's a lot of conversation around team sports actually right now, football, rugby, the contact sports, and how that actually impacts the players later in their lives that nobody actually has ever even thought about before. But now it's starting to come to light that later on in life, those people could potentially have neurological problems to do with that. So, yeah, it's true. It could be anything, couldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We hear a lot of these stories in the United States about football players or American football players suffering from what's known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, where it's pretty much, it looks like the brain looks like it's going through Alzheimer's, but it isn't Alzheimer's. It's due to multiple head injuries. And again, they don't even have to be these massive ones. But in addition to that, actually, one of the biggest risk groups that are at risk for concussions and post-concussion syndrome are actually young female soccer players. Not because they're getting massively, injured, but they're getting these multiple headers, hitting their heads or the soccer balls with their heads throughout the day. Those little things over time could build up and lead up to a lot of symptoms that, again, many people don't even doctors don't link. If they're psychological or mental or depression or anxiety, many healthcare providers, I find, don't link the emotional imbalances with the root cause actually being from a head injury. And so I find that's really sad, because the treatments are completely different. If a person suffers from anxiety or depression, usually the conventional route is medications or talk therapy. And many times that can help with the symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily address the root cause, especially if the root cause is from a physical trauma of a head injury. And even with using wonderful things like functional medicine or nutrition or natural medicine, if we just focus on diet and supplements and herbs, that doesn't fix the physical trauma of the brain. It helps the chemical trauma, it helps put out inflammation, but it doesn't actually help to reconnect the different areas of the brain that have been, the communication lines that have been somewhat damaged or, impacted by the head injury. And so in addition to doing things, looking at diet or supplements, even lifestyle strategies, we need to do things to actually help harness the power of what we call neuroplasticity to actually retrain and reconnect the different areas of the nervous system that have been damaged in a head injury. And again, a head injury, a person might suffer from brain fog, or they might suffer from some memory issues, or just not think as clearly as they used to prior to the head injury. But because everything is connected and the nervous system controls everything, including the gut, a person could have a head injury and maybe not have too many neurological symptoms, but they might have developed autoimmunity, or they might have developed, digestive issues or chronic digestive problems that don't respond to the normal treatments.
Yes, definitely. It's about connecting the dots in the right way in the end for the patients. And yes, a lot of people will end up in this frustrating situation where they're just going at it from all sorts of angles, but they're still not resolving it, and that could be the missing one. So, and you sort of touched on neuroplasticity. So could you actually just go a little bit more into the details of and explaining the concept of neuroplasticity and also neuroepigenetics? Because they both play a role, of course, in the recovery from what we're describing.
Yes, they form the basis of my life's work, those two concepts, neuroplasticity and neuroepigenetics. And really, at the end of the day, for me, what those two concepts represent is hope. With neuroepigenetics, it talks about how our brains can actually change the genetic expression based on our experiences. So things like the foods we eat, the lifestyle choices we make can turn on or off genes that lead to brain health or brain disease. And neuroplasticity is kind of correlates with neuroepigenetics, but it speaks to specifically when we have changes in the genetic expression of neuronal connections and the different, ways that neurons and brain cells talk to one another. That's what we call neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is just amazing. Isn't it just totally amazing that we can, through our own mental willpower, right, and our own intentions, really create the life of our design? And that's due to the power of neuroplasticity. And so the different things that we can do, like, for example, there's research that shows how meditation can literally change the structure of your brain cells and neural networks. And when you change the structure of your brain, then you change its function. And when you change its function, you literally change your experience of yourself and the world around you.
Yeah, I loved it that you talk about hope. That's exactly how I felt when I discovered epigenetics. And that was it's just so amazing that suddenly we're going from being disempowered, because for decades and decades we believed that whether it's, any other part of the body, but also the brain, that everything is just as is. And if it gets messed up for whatever reason, that's it. There's not a lot we can do about that. And definitely there was that belief as for the brain itself, because it was meant to be, fixed, and it is what it is, and you just have to live with it and put up with it. But now we definitely, there's just so much promise and so much hope, and sometimes it's really simple to, bring yourselves back and get rid of those neurological symptoms that, people sometimes struggle with for years, and it really ruins the quality of their lives. Yet sometimes, a lot of the time, it's really simple tools, isn't it? It's simple tools that we can use to help that. It's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how I look at it, really, is it's the simple things, as long as they're personalized to that, individual and what they need, what their unique genetic needs are or neurological needs are. And so I look at brain health really is rooted in three major pillars. Number one is the physical brain, and that talks about how well do the physical connections between the different neural networks communicate with one another? And then the second thing I look at is what's going on with the chemical brain. Is there a lot of inflammation? Is there heavy metals? Are there hormone imbalances impacting brain health? And finally, the third thing I look at is the mental emotional brain. How much stress are we dealing with? What are our belief systems that we're holding that might be holding us back from living the life of our dreams and really healing if we're struggling with chronic illness? And so at the end of the day, it's really those three things that I look at when I work with all my patients. What's going on with the physical, chemical, and emotional mental brains? And the great thing is sometimes it could be something as simple as, taking more fish oils or DHA to help with the communication between the physical brain and then decreasing inflammation in the mental brain. And that's the thing, because it's all connected. When we work on the physical brain, a lot of times things improve in the mental world, right? Or the emotional world, or vice versa. If we work on the chemical brain, things improve in the physical brain. So it's really important assessing all three areas. So that way a patient, if they're suffering from autoimmunity or chronic neurological symptoms like concussion, that we can give them the appropriate treatments. And so just like you're saying, it could be so simple sometimes. Like for me, when I removed gluten, that completely changed my life. Like a lot of those psychological darker symptoms that I talked about earlier, like the anger and the paranoia and all that, those started to just lift. It was like this dark cloud started to lift, and it literally changed my life. And it was ironic because I had been, teaching my patients for years on the dangers of gluten. And so I even, experimented, and I was about 80% gluten-free for over the course of many years. But it wasn't until I went 100% that a lot of those really deeper, darker symptoms started to resolve.
Yeah, that is, this is a very similar experience that a lot of people have out there. Exactly. It does, and it's just that one thing. But sometimes, yes, you're quite right. It needs to be 100%. That's the thing. So people who are listening, if you're kind of gluten-free, maybe it's time you went 100% gluten-free and then see what happens, right? See what happens, because, it could be big.
Yeah, you be the experiment and you be the evidence. Test it out and see how it changes your life, and that's the thing. It's like, it's really the actions that we take. And for the longest time, I would just learn all this knowledge to be able to apply to my patients, but I wouldn't necessarily put it all to my life. And it wasn't until I started experimenting and finding out what really worked for me that I started feeling better, and started to heal my own brain.
Yeah, for sure. No, I have similar experiences myself. So for sure, I'm relating to everything you're saying. So in your latest book, the Brain Safe book, you talk about the root cause approach to post-concussion syndrome. So could you talk a little bit more about that, what you mean by that, and what is that approach?
Sure. So when I practice what I call root cause neurology, and it's a system that I've developed after working with thousands of patients, teaching thousands of doctors, and healing my own brain. And it's really the core question, again, is rooted in this idea of neurology, is asking the question, why? If someone's still struggling with the symptoms of concussion, or they have anxiety, or even autoimmunity, it's like, why are they struggling with those symptoms? And so root cause neurology, when I talk about neurological symptoms, it's all about finding out the root cause for concussion. And the number one root cause for people struggling with concussion symptoms or brain fog or neurological symptoms is due to imbalances in what we call neural networks. And within our nervous system, as you know, we have neurons or brain cells. And you can think of them, they're kind of like the individuals of a community, right? And if you have a lot of individuals that live close to one another, that's like a little neighborhood. We call that a brain region. And when different brain regions that, different communities that live far apart, like we can have like a neural or a brain region we call the frontal lobe here. It communicates with a brain region called the cerebellum back here. We call that communication network a neural network. And so the root cause for post-concussion symptoms, as well as a lot of other neurological symptoms like brain fog or anxiety, is due to imbalances or weaknesses in these neural networks. And so I talk all about that in my book. A lot of times patients will have gone to other doctors and have MRIs done or CT scans and other tests, and everything comes up, quote unquote, normal. The reason for that is because a lot of times if someone suffers a head injury, you're not going to see structural damage that can be picked up by an MRI or CT. And so that's so frustrating for people. So many patients, when they go to their doctors, a lot of times they're just written off. They're like, it's just in your head, right? Well, the truth is it actually is in your head. But what I mean by that is in the neural networks in your head. So my point is you're not crazy if you're suffering from neurological symptoms, especially if you've had a head injury. It's due to these imbalances and weakening of the connections of the neural networks. And so with that understanding, hope is just on the horizon and healing is totally possible.
That's basically, yes, that's what we want to hold on to, that healing is possible, and that is really brilliant. And so there are obviously all those different aspects, and you're talking about the pillars of brain health, the physical, the chemical, the emotional. But we touched on foods, and obviously we mentioned gluten. But could you actually summarize the top foods that are actually helpful and promote brain health versus foods to avoid, other than gluten, obviously?
Yeah, so when it comes to the health of your brain, one of the most important nutrients is fat, because your brain is made up of 60% fat. So like I talked about before, things such as fish oils or docosahexaenoic acid, which is a specific type of fatty acid found in high amounts in fish oils, is very nourishing and healing for the brain. In addition, things like coconut oil, which are high in medium chain triglycerides, which are easily absorbed by the gut and then can cross a blood-brain barrier, those are wonderful for helping to, really bring health to the cell membranes in the brain cells, as well as the connections we call synapses. Synaptic connections, a lot of those synaptic connections where communication happens between brain cells is due to this wonderful resource of fat and fatty acids. Because the fat you eat, when you eat that, it actually gets incorporated into your cell membranes, including the membranes of your neurons. And through the brilliant work of Bruce Lipton, he talks about how really it's the cell membranes. That's where communication happens between your cells, but especially your brain cells. So things like fat, like fish oils, if there are vegetarians or vegans out there, you can also get DHA in seaweed or algae. You can get great sources that way. Things like coconut oil, wonderful source of fat and fuel for the brain, as well as avocado, nuts, and seeds. So those are really important because it's one of the major building blocks for your brain, which is fat. Another really important type of nutrient is polyphenols. And those are those wonderful, beautiful colors that we find in all different foods, like broccoli, which gives that green color, and blueberries, which gives it that beautiful, dark blue, purplish color, and things like curcumin, which is found in turmeric, which gives it that, very vibrant and beautiful yellow color. So all those polyphenols, what they do, they actually activate epigenetic responses that lead to protection of our mitochondria. And so when it comes to brain health, and really when it comes to health in general, I'm sure Evan, all our listeners, the mitochondria is so very important, because they are the battery packs for our cells and especially our brain. And so when we eat foods that are, rich in all these beautiful colors, when we eat from the rainbow, we actually activate genetic expressions to help protect our mitochondria, decrease inflammation, as well as enhance detoxification. So those are some of the core foods that I love eating in my diet, and I recommend to a lot of my patients who have concussion or neurological symptoms. But as well, in addition to my patients with autoimmunity, because all those things, when we talk about mitochondrial health, or when we talk about healthy fats, those across the board, those are things that everyone could really benefit from. And another one that is really important is eating foods that are rich in fiber, insoluble fiber as well as soluble fiber, because those types of foods, like things, low glycemic vegetables like arugula, or I just had lunch with some pea shoots, those are really high in great types of fibers that our microbiome, meaning the good bacteria that live in our gut, they feed on those. And when they eat those, they release really healing compounds that can help decrease inflammation in the brain as well as the rest of the body.
Excellent. And what about anti-brain foods apart from gluten? You already know.
Yeah, so anti-brain foods, really, it's any foods that trigger inflammation. That's one of the key things. Because when we talk about head injuries, when I had hit my head, and I've actually suffered multiple head injuries, what happened in my brain, there was a chemical trauma in addition to the physical trauma known as immunoexcitotoxicity. And the immuno portion of that word, that long scientific word, really refers to an inflammatory response triggered after a head injury. And so we want to make sure that we eat foods that don't drive more inflammation. And everyone's genetically, unique in what might cause inflammation. But across the board, like I mentioned before, gluten is a very common trigger. Dairy is a very common trigger. Other types of grains. And I work with a lot of patients with autoimmunity. And I find a lot of my patients are very sensitive to grains. And that triggers inflammation that can not only impact their thyroid or maybe impact their nervous system, but it can also impact their brains. So other types of inflammatory foods are, like I talked about, grains, but also sugar and excessive sugar. But most of us, because there's so much added sugar to all types of foods and processed foods, that it causes massive inflammation in our bodies and our brains. In fact, a lot of research are talking about Alzheimer's disease as being called type 3 diabetes, and referring to this imbalance of insulin insensitivity in brain cells. And so that can be really damaging for people with a family history of Alzheimer's, or who might already be kind of losing their memory and not as sharp as they used to. So sugar is a very powerful inflammatory food. And finally, when we talk about immunoexcitotoxicity, that chemical trauma that happens after brain injury, the excitotoxic part refers to this neurotransmitter, what we call glutamate. And so glutamate is a neurotransmitter, or a chemical compound in our brain that helps neurons talk to one another. But what happens after a head injury, brain cells, some of them actually die. And when they die, they release their contents into the chemical environment of the brain. Some of those contents include what's known as glutamate. So normally, glutamate is very intentionally released and so the communication is very intentional and focused between brain cells. But when you have brain injury and you have a release of the glutamate, then the neighboring brain cells take up that glutamate and they become overexcited, overstimulated. That's what we call excitotoxicity. They can literally excite themselves to death because they don't have the metabolic capacity to process all that excitation and activation. They can literally die. So whenever I work with patients with head injuries or any chronic neurological condition, I'm looking at what's happening with immunoexcitotoxicity. So doing things to lower inflammation as well as doing things to stop the excitotoxic process. One of the biggest things that our listeners can do to avoid excessive excitotoxicity, even if they don't have a brain injury, is remove foods that have artificial sweeteners. So things like aspartame, they actually mimic these excitatory neurotransmitters that can overstimulate the brain and cause a lot of, concurrent or future brain damage.
And that's brilliant advice. And of course, now particularly I'm based in Spain, but I know that in the UK at the moment, they've got this big thing about there's a government initiative for cutting down sugar in all sorts of foods. But of course, what do they put in it instead? They put artificial sweeteners in those things, a lot of those products to replace sugar. And then, of course, we're creating another problem, right?
Yeah, and that happened in the United States too, when all those research articles demonizing fat back in the day, in the 1950s or whatever. So everyone's like, okay, if we're going to get rid of fat, then we have to, get the calories somewhere else. And so it's low-fat foods where they add more sugar or artificial sweeteners, and that just led to an entire different epidemic that we're dealing with today. I think the root cause of a lot of chronic degenerative diseases like autoimmunity, as well as neurodegenerative diseases like chronic traumatic encephalopathy and Alzheimer's. So yeah, it's like we have to, when are we going to have common sense? When are our officials going to actually really understand, what's happening with the power of food as medicine and choose and promote foods that really lead to the health of our communities? I'm waiting for that day, but I'm optimistic because there's a lot more information. There's a lot more people like you sharing the word, and a lot of my colleagues in the world of functional medicine, they're really getting the message out there. So I'm very optimistic, but we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for the governments to catch up, we're probably looking at another 10 to 20 years. But of course, there's all sorts of sources of information so that people actually tend to go to more these days, which is really great. So we mentioned food, and that's really helpful. But can you actually emphasize the importance of movement in terms of brain health? Because I'm always keen to get that message through, because it is super important, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because when it comes to health, and especially when it comes to brain health, a lot of times people within natural medicine or functional medicine, we get trained to really focus in on the chemical brain, meaning, okay, what are good nutrients, what are good supplements, what's a good diet, what are good foods to eat, what are foods to avoid, and all that is essential for brain health, because that helps to create the perfect environment for neuroplasticity. But in order for neuroplasticity to actually happen, in order for us to actually literally change the structure and function in our experience of the world, the brain is unique in that not only does it require nutrition and, a healthy chemical environment, it actually requires activation and therapies. It needs stimulation. So one of the most powerful ways of activating the brain, believe it or not, is by physical movement and exercise. Because when I move my body, when I'm sitting here, even though I'm not moving that much, when I sit here, the world is spinning. It's spinning very, we don't really feel it, but even our heartbeats, these minor subtle movements that we have just dealing with gravity, or when my heart beats, my core muscles have to activate so I don't fall over, believe it or not. And a lot of people who lose their core strength, minor, changes in balance could have them fall over. But my point is, one of the core ways of activating the brain is by physical movement, because when you sit there, or when you stand up, or when you're walking, not only are you improving circulation and blood flow to your brain, you're also stimulating these neuronal pathways that start in these joint mechanoreceptors, these muscle spindles, all these little receptors of movement. They get triggered, they get excited, and then they tell the brain, hey, there's movement happening. And it happens in multiple neural networks related to what we call the cerebellum, as well as the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. So my point is, when we move, we literally activate neuronal pathways that create neuroplasticity in our brains. And so the cool thing is, in my practice, when I do a neurological exam, I can identify exactly which neural network is weak or imbalanced, and then be very specific and intentional in terms of what treatment or what exercise to give that person. So as an example, a very common practice in my neurological examination is testing balance. And so I look at patients, I have them balanced with their feet together, with their eyes open, eyes closed. I have them balanced with their left foot versus their right foot. And many times I'll find that maybe they have problems balancing on their left foot versus their right. They'll be a lot more solid on their right foot, but they'll be kind of wobbly on the left. So that tells me I can actually have them do balance exercises, just balancing on the left side of their body, or doing these complex, what we call figure 8 movements with the left arm. Because when people do that, not only are they exercising their muscles, they're actually activating that neural pathway that I just told you about, from the receptors in the muscles, joints, and what we call Golgi tendon organs. And that sends a signal up the spinal cord to the cerebellum on that same side. So, for example, if a person has an issue balancing on their left, I'll give them balance exercises on the left and arm movements on the left, because that'll actually create neuroplasticity and activation in that left cerebellum.
That's awesome. And I was keen to emphasize this because a lot of people with autoimmunity avoid movement because, they may be in pain. They may just be worried that they're going to exacerbate their symptoms. But we're obviously not talking about exercising for hours and hours every day. That's not what we're talking about here. And sometimes even, 10 minutes of walking can make a massive difference to somebody's health, right?
Exactly. And, what I really love about neurology is understanding why does exercise help the brain, and a lot of people talk about what's known as BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's like miracle grow for your brain, meaning when you walk and when you exercise, you actually your brain creates more of this compound that helps with neuroplasticity, and it helps protect your brain. So again, exercise impacts the chemical brain. But what I'm talking about specifically, we can use, and what I'm so excited about, we can use specific types of exercise to target different regions of the brain. So for example, if a person needs help with their cerebellum because they have balance problems, if they have coordination issues, or they're a bit clumsy, or even if they have chronic neck and back pain, core exercises, things like yoga or Pilates or doing these balance exercises, very specifically targets the cerebellum. Or if someone needs help with their prefrontal lobe, if they've had a head injury and they have difficulty like focusing and concentrating, maybe organizing their schedule, and they just feel scatterbrained, they can do physical exercise to exercise the prefrontal lobe. And a lot of that deals with, for example, playing catch. Because when you play catch, you have to anticipate where the ball is going to come for you to catch it. Well, guess what? The prefrontal lobe is involved with anticipation. So by simply playing catch, maybe with someone's left hand versus their right, we can target very specifically the right prefrontal lobe. And so I'm so excited because of neurology. I understand how we can use exercise so very specifically, right? Because I'm sure a lot of people out there, they might have been to their doctors, and their doctor's like, if they're somewhat enlightened doctor, they'll be like, oh, you should change your diet and exercise, right? But what? How should I change my diet? What kind of exercises should I do? So I'm talking about through a very advanced neurological evaluation, I can figure out what areas of the brain needs that specific activation and prescribe very specific therapies and or exercises to target the left cerebellum versus the right prefrontal lobe. And it's a really exciting field right now, functional neurology. And in addition, what you're talking about, just going for a walk, what's cool is in your brain, there's this neural network called the default mode network. And what that is, that's kind of like the standby of your brain. People used to think, when you're just sitting around, not really doing anything or thinking about anything, your brain shut down. That's further from the truth. One specific network that deals with attention shuts down. But guess what? This other network that we call the default mode network, that becomes activated. And what the default mode network is all about, it allows for brain healing, it allows for insight, and it allows for creativity. So as an example, if you find that you're sitting at your desk all day and you work a really long job that requires a lot of mental energy, like I do, seeing patients all day or writing, working on my books and blogs, what's a really great exercise, not only, going for a walk, but going for a walk with no goal in mind. meaning you're just going to go wander around. If you have the luxury, if you live by a park, or if you could go hiking, you don't set any goal like, okay, I want to walk for 5 minutes or 5 miles. You just go meandering, walking around, because guess what? When you do that type of exercise, you activate your default mode network, and that allows for integration, that allows for brain healing, and it also allows for insight and creativity. Whereas if you want to train your focus, there's this other neural network that we call the central executive network that allows us to really be focused and concentrate on tasks. Another specific exercise you can do is actually go for a jog, or a run, depending on your level of health, but with a very specific goal, being like, okay, I want to jog until I reach this, when I get to that next stoplight, or I want to jog for 5 minutes. So when you set a goal and then you run to meet that goal, you're literally activating a very specific neural network related to attention and focus. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool. And I'm so into exercising. I didn't know that particular bit. So, having a goal versus not having a goal, and the different activations, that's really cool.
It changes, like, if you're walking and you don't have a goal versus walking, you have a goal, you're going to still have the same physical benefits. Like, you're going to improve blood circulation to your heart, to your cells, to your brain. You're going to help, if you do it within your ability, you're going to help decrease inflammation, decrease stress. But when you change the actual your mindset around it, you literally change the specific neural networks that you're targeting. And yeah, that's just so cool, because again, if I work with patients who have like brain fog or concussion, many of them need more training in their central executive network, the ones that help them with focus and concentration. So I might not have them just walk around and meander. I might be like, okay, I want you to jog for 5 minutes a day, 3 times a week, and set this goal. So when they set their goal towards that, not only are they improving, their body's health, they're activating a very specific neural network related to focus and attention.
That is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. I so enjoyed learning about this. So actually, before I let you go, can you just briefly talk about sensory genomics and some of the clever exercises that people can do, or we all can actually benefit from in terms of sensory genomics?
Absolutely. So sensory genomics is this term I coined based on this idea of epigenetics, right, that we talked about. And so normally when we talk about epigenetics, a lot of people talk about, okay, when you eat certain foods high in polyphenols, it activates these transcription factors leading to decreased inflammation and better health, right? So that's one way of activating epigenetics. But another way of activating neural epigenetics, so the epigenetics that impacts our brain, is through our senses. Because all of our different senses, like our sense of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, as well as the sense of proprioception or body awareness, they literally activate neural pathways, like I talked about before, that target specific areas of our nervous system. So for example, as I'm sitting here talking to you and I'm looking at you, I'm activating these light pathways that end up in the occipital lobe of my brain, as well as the temporal lobe for processing. So I see you and I'm like, who is this? Oh, it's Eva, right? So multiple neural networks are being activated. And so that's using the sense of vision. But the thing is, like I said, a lot of my patients who've had concussions, they have specific imbalances. So maybe they don't need their entire occipital lobe activated. Maybe it's just the left one. So what I can do, I can shine light coming in from their right visual field. And what that does, that targets very specifically their left occipital lobe. And that can help with vision, that can help with migraines, and that can also help target the temporal lobe for people who might suffer from seizures or anger issues after their head injury, or if they just suffer from that right now. Because a lot of seizure activity or uncontrollable anger issues is due to imbalances in the temporal lobe. In addition, if I want to activate the temporal lobe, I could use the sense of sound. Because when I listen to music, especially like music that's has a very specific steady beat, that can activate my left temporal lobe versus my right. Both of them will get activated, but the left will become more activated preferentially. So it's personal training for your brain, right? Because if you're going to go to a personal trainer and you have the goal of losing weight and to build muscles, they might put you on the diet, they might give you some supplements, and you'll probably lose weight if it's the right diet for you. But how are you going to build the muscles? You actually have to do the actual exercise. So in this analogy, that type of exercise for your brain is sensory genomics. And so we can use sensory genomics to trigger experience-dependent neuroplasticity, meaning we can use our senses to literally change the structure, function of our brain, and from there, really target and hone in on the healing process for each person with their individual neurological needs.
That's great. And I know you've got an ebook where people can learn a little bit more about that and read more about that and actually just read up on the sort of more exercises to do. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. On my website, I have an ebook that I written talks all about sensory genomics. And at the end of that book, there's 5 exercises that people can do to really start this process. Because again, I love learning, I love knowledge, but when it comes to healing, it's the actions that we take that will really make the difference. In addition, I talked to you and you mentioned my new book, Brain Save. I'm super excited about this because it just came out. It's available on Amazon. And it's specifically written for people who've had concussions. And like I said, it might not even be a massive blackout injury where you lose consciousness, but maybe if you're struggling with some brain fog or you're struggling with autoimmunity or neurological symptoms and you know you've had a history of a head injury in the past, that can really be due to the concussion. And so in the book, I also talk about the 7 top brain save exercises to help target the neural networks inside a person's brain that could be leading to their symptoms. I also talk about, because I was talking about, you might have had a head injury before that could be triggering some of your symptoms or leading to your symptoms. So the people out there might be wondering, well, is that me? So in the actual book, what I do is I talk about the most common neural networks that can be triggering your neurological symptoms. So for example, a very common neural network that is injured in a brain injury is what we call the prefrontal cortex. And I actually have a quiz here that people can go through and grade it and find out, do I have an issue in my prefrontal lobe? Or another very common neural network that's related to concussion, or even a lot of patients I've worked with autoimmunity, is the cerebellar neural network. And so, for example, you can go through and do a little checklist, balance problems, clumsiness, do you have tremors, do you have chronic neck and back pain, and you can grade that to find out which neural networks might be at the root cause for your symptoms as well. And so then they can do that. And then at the end of the book, I have the 6-week plan that you can then match the neural network with the actual exercise that will target and create that neuroplasticity. Yeah, I'm so excited for this book. I've been wanting to write a book my entire life, and I've finally done it, and I can't be more thrilled.
It sounds amazing. It sounds like a really super practical book, and I'll be getting that. It's definitely, it sounds amazing. So yeah, I encourage everybody else to go and check it out. That's just been so fantastic. I really, really enjoyed this interview, talking to you. Before we go, is there anything else that you want to mention apart from the book? Any other things that you were up to?
Yeah, so that's really the most exciting news I have is the release of this book. And right now I'm working on a lot of other projects based off of the book to continue that process, to really, because my mission, I've struggled with head injuries. I've worked with thousands of patients over the years that aren't getting the care that they need. And really my goal in writing this book and doing a lot of what I do is getting that information out to people who need it. Because we at our office here, we offer this 5-day in-office intensive brain healing program. And I realized that not everyone could make it out here. And we work with patients on a case-by-case basis. So not everyone that applies gets accepted. it, unfortunately. So that's why I decided to write this book, is to get this information out to all the millions of people suffering from post-concussion syndrome, whether they can make it out here or not. And so a lot of this, the projects that I'm working with is really related and riffing off this work that I'm doing in terms of post-concussion syndrome and how that is at the root cause for a lot of people's chronic neurological, but sometimes even autoimmune symptoms where they might not even realize it, or their doctors that are working with it. The post-concussion syndrome being as a major trigger and root cause, that needs to be addressed, in addition to functional medicine, things like diet, supplements, herbs, and lifestyle changes. So, yeah, I can't be more excited about it. And, yeah, I really appreciate you inviting me on to talk about my work, and really appreciate all the things that you're doing to get this information out to the world as well.
Well, thank you so much again for you've shared so generously, and we just, from all of us here, myself and everybody watching, massive appreciation. And Dr. Titus, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope this is not the last time we speak.
Absolutely. And if people want to learn more about my practice in root cause neurology, they can go to my website. It's www.drtituschew.com.
Thank you very much.